Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another season on Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge. I'm very happy to welcome you back. If this is your first year, you're joining a great community and you get to enjoy puffins and other seabirds that are nesting out here on this wonderful island. My name is Keenan Yakola. This is my 5th season as the Seal Island supervisor, managing a crew of 4 to 5 interns with the National Audubon Seabird Restoration Program and Project Puffin. So today's chat is really just an introduction to the season. We're going to be talking about some of our new nesting birds. There's a new nesting pair in our puffin burrow. So we'll talk a little bit about them, and then we'll take it away with whatever questions you have from there. I first want to just talk a little bit about Seal Island. It's a really unique island. We're located about 22 miles off of mid-coast Maine from Rockland, if you're familiar with that town. And Seal Island is about a 65-acre island that is owned by the Maine Coastal Island National Wildlife Refuge. The island is about a mile long, and it curves, and it's very rocky. It's windswept and treeless, a perfect habitat for nesting seabirds away from people and close to good forage fish. The island at its widest point is only around 100 to 300 yards wide, so it's quite a skinny island, but the rocky boulders really provide perfect habitat for nesting seabirds. The island hosts a wide diversity of nesting seabirds. It's not just puffins. We have one of the largest puffin colonies in the Gulf of Maine, with between 500 and 600, maybe a little more this year, nesting pairs. We also host 2 nesting pairs of terns. We have common terns and Arctic terns, which nest on this island. And you'll see them all around on all of the cams that we have. And we host around a little over 2,000 pairs on this island, around 900 pairs of Arctic terns and 1,300 pairs of common terns. And that marks the largest colony in the Gulf of Maine for nesting terns in the region. We also have a couple of different nesting gulls that you'll see from time to time. We have the great blackback gull, one of the largest gulls, if not the largest in the world, as well as the herring gull, which also nests on this island in small numbers on the other end of the island, a bit further away from the nesting puffins. We also have, in addition to puffins, we have other alcids or species that are closely related to puffins, including the razorbill, which looks very similar. It's a little bit larger than puffin, a black back and a white belly, and then they have a little bit different shaped bill. It's a little more thin, a little bit longer, and it has a nice white stripe down it, and they have a white stripe through their eye as well. And we also have nesting black guillemots, and we have probably close to 500 pairs of them, maybe a bit more, and they're black birds with white wing patches, and we have a burrow camera hosted by explore.org that you can watch this summer. It just went live. The angle's a little off, so I'm going to mess with that later today so we can get a better view of those nesting guillemots, and hopefully their egg will be laid within the next couple weeks. We also have 2 different species of nesting cormorants on Seal Island. We have the double-crested cormorant, which is a species that you likely see at perhaps an inland pond or along the coast. It's a very common species that's distributed through the entirety of the United States and up into Canada. And we also have a very special species called the great cormorant. It's a very rare seabird in the state of Maine, and Seal Island hosts the largest colony. Last year we had only 32 pairs, and only around 40 pairs nest in the Gulf of Maine. So they're a very rare seabird, and we're happy to have them here on Seal Island. And there's a couple other seabird species that you might occasionally see or hear. If you log on to the live cams, especially the exterior boulder berm cam or the boulder berm cam itself, you might see Leach's storm petrels flying around at night, and they make some great noises, and I would highly recommend you looking them up on either our Project Puffin website or just Googling them, and you can find their calls and you can learn what to look for when you're looking at those cams at night. They only come back to the colony at night, and that's the only time you'll see them flying. And the last species that I'll mention that you might see on our live cams is the common eider. The males are black and white. They're very bold and they're very striking, and you might see them floating by from time and time again, and the females are more of a brown duck. So those are some species to keep an eye out for. Those are the species that we work with, and we don't just work with the puffins. We put a lot of effort into managing all those different species here on the island. So just a little bit of news that I wanted to share with you all this year. So far this year, we've had really high numbers of puffins around the island, multiple occasions, I've counted over 1,000 puffins around the island. So really spectacular numbers. And over the past 4 or 5 springs, I don't recall ever seeing that many on a regular basis. So hopefully this means that we have an increasing population. Some interesting notes about that is that back in between 2003 and or 2011 and 2013, we didn't have very high productivity for our puffins. The chicks weren't getting enough to eat, and they weren't fledging at very good weights. So their survival rates were likely quite low. Now, puffins usually take around 5 years to nest. So the past few years, we've been seeing the returning birds from those poor years coming back. And it is likely that those cohorts, or those groups of puffins from those specific years, were likely not very large. However, the birds that we're seeing now, the new birds returning, are from 2014 and 2015, and those were actually generally pretty good years. So what we think might be happening is that we're hopefully having more of those birds coming back and thinking about nesting. And on a day like this, if you're watching our live cams, we've had tons of puffins out today. They've been all over the rocks, and a lot of those are probably birds like Pal from 2014, one of the burrow cam chicks on the Explore.org camera. And hopefully he'll be nesting this year. And another bird that I'd like to quickly mention here is the razorbill. And this spring we've had our highest counts ever of razorbills on Seal Island. We've been seeing well over 200 individuals around the island. And when I first started with the project back in 2014, there was only 16 pairs of razorbills nesting on Seal Island, and they first began nesting in the early 2000s on the island. But last year we had over 60 pairs, and we've been having our highest counts ever this year in 2019. So we're hoping that those numbers will continue to increase, but we're going to keep monitoring them to see what happens this summer. But some exciting news to start off the season already. So with that, I would like to move into talking a little bit more about our burrow cam, and specifically some of the things that have been going on there. It's been a really interesting spring. If we remember a couple of years ago, we had our old puffin pair, Finn and Phoebe, were displaced from the burrow that we were watching, and they were replaced by Willie and Billy. And the first year that that pair was in the burrow, in 2016, they did not have a chick. However, last year they had a chick and they did quite well. But this year, Willie happened to come back, but he did not bring Billy back, or they did not come back together. So we're not entirely sure what happened. It's quite possible that she might be taking a year off from breeding. Maybe she didn't make it through the winter, which we definitely hope did not happen. And it is also possible that she found a different mate or decided to nest in a different burrow. And that was the case with Phoebe, I believe, a couple of years back, who is still around and is still nesting. So we're going to be keeping an eye out for Billy. We banded her, so we know her as an individual. And hopefully we will be able to track her down this season. We have interns out in the bird blinds right now that are reading puffin bands, and hopefully they'll know if she's still there. So just a reminder about Willie. Willie is an older puffin. Willie is around 17 years old, and I don't know if I've told people in the past, but he was banded on July 16th, 2002. So if anybody wants to celebrate his band day, it's not his birthday per se, or his hatch day, but he was banded on July 16th of 2002, making him 17 years old this year. So he's a bit of an older puffin. He's certainly bred multiple times, and we got to watch one season of his nesting. But we don't really know how old Millie is. She's at least 5 years old. I'm pretty confident about that. But beyond that, I'm not quite sure. We do have plans to band her, which is one of the questions I believe I'll get to. But we won't do that until they hopefully hatch a chick. We want to minimize disturbance right now and let them incubate that egg. So with that, I'm going to jump into some of your questions. I know many of you have a lot of questions about that new pair in our puffin burrow, and we can talk more about them for sure. So getting into our questions, the first question was, I was wondering when Millie laid the egg she and Willie have, and when is it due to hatch? So from my notes, their egg was laid on May 14th, about midday. And usually puffins take around 40 days to incubate, plus or minus a few days before their egg hatches. So what we're looking at is probably around a June 25th hatch date, but it could be a few days earlier, or perhaps a few days later. Some folks have expressed some concern for the egg being left alone. This was especially the case about a week ago, where the egg was left alone for many hours on end. And this isn't too unusual for puffins, especially early in the incubation period. The egg can certainly tolerate being alone for hours on end at a time early in the incubation period. But as it gets later and later and later into the incubation period and we get closer to hatching, that's when we would have a little bit more of a concern for the egg being left alone. And part of the egg being left alone could be Millie's potential inexperience at incubating this egg, and this could be her very first egg. So we don't know, unfortunately, but it could potentially be that inexperience, but hopefully she's settling in, and the egg will be better incubated throughout the rest of this process until it hatches. So our next question here is regarding sea surface temperatures. I know if any of you follow our egg rock updates, there's been several stories in the past few years about how sea surface temperature influences puffins and also other seabirds that are nesting in the region. And I just wanted to share some data with you guys about the sea surface temperature. This year, we're actually not above average. The past few years, we've been quite warm. But this year, we've actually been quite cool. And I went through some of our old sea surface temperature data from years past this morning and was comparing them to this date, all the years past. So this year, we're averaging between 41 and 43 degrees right about now. And the past few years, it's been a bit different. 2018 was a very warm year. It was 47 to 48 degrees at the end of May. Which is really about 5 to 6 degrees warmer than it is right now on Seal Island. And in 2017, we're about 45 to 46, which is about average. In 2016, we had another warm year, and that was 48 to 49 degrees Fahrenheit. And then 2015, we were around that 45 to 46 degree mark. So what we're seeing so far this year is that we're a bit cooler than average, and our interns have also been a bit colder than average. We've been experiencing some cold weather, some cold, foggy, wet days, and it hasn't been getting too warm yet. So it's difficult to say how that's going to play out for the puffins, but it is a bit colder than average this year, and we'll see how it plays out. So our next question is, could you tell us any reasons why Billy didn't come back with Willie this year? Was she old? Could she have just changed partners? I did already address this a little bit, but just to rehash what I said earlier, it's difficult to say. When we banded Billy, we didn't quite know how old she was. She was unbanded. She was an unbanded adult, so we just knew that she was greater than 5 years old, but it's difficult for us to estimate age past that mark. So we just knew that she was an adult when we banded her. And it's really difficult to say why she didn't come back. She could have taken a year off. She could have found a new mate, or she could have passed away during the winter, which we certainly hope did not happen. Our next question is, can you tell us how old Millie is from looking at the pictures of her, or will you not know until you meet her in person? And the last part of this is, will Millie be banded? So I don't think that we'll have an exact age on Millie at all, ever. Unfortunately, we can just tell that she's an adult, meaning that she's over 4 years old. And we do plan on banding her. We don't think we'll band her until after the egg hatches, just to minimize the disturbance to this new pair. Our next question is, last year Gracie had such a dramatic journey when the supply of fish was low. Do we expect a similar amount of fish available this year, or can you not tell yet? So it's a difficult thing to figure out at this point. Last year we had much warmer sea surface temperatures, as I talked about earlier, and that certainly influenced the amount of prey that was available for these birds. But this year it's a bit colder. One thing that we do know is that some species are more common in puffin diet with a colder sea surface temperature. One example of this is hake, and we think that white hake is the most common hake species that we observe in the diet of these seabirds. And white hake typically prefer cooler sea surface temperatures, and we typically see them throughout the puffin chick rearing period, as well as the terns. So we're hoping that white hake is an abundant prey for these species this year. but ultimately only time will tell. It is possible that other species that have been important in years past, such as haddock, could be common again. But ultimately, we need to just start waiting for those puffin chicks to hatch, and then we can start analyzing some of their diet through photography and in our bird blinds when we're studying this. So far, we have been watching the diet of some of the terns that are nesting on Seal Island, and although the terns don't have chicks, they often bring a fish back, and you might see them flying by the camera carrying a fish. They don't have chicks right now, but they are provisioning their mate. It's typically the males that are bringing in a fish for the female and displaying with that fish. And we can identify those fish when they bring them in. And so far this year, we've seen hake, smelt, and some invertebrates such as krill. But it's hard to say what that means for the rest of the season. So we will move on to our next question, which is, I read that some fish swim more quickly in warmer water. Is this true of any fish in the puffin diet? So there's a few interesting points to this question. It is possible that some fish could swim more quickly and swim more, they could swim further with warmer temperatures. Warmer temperatures in fish quickly increases their metabolism. They have to eat more, but they have more energy to travel further. But it's difficult to say exactly how the fish species that we observe in puffin diet will respond. A lot of these fish species that the terns and the puffins are eating are unmanaged and they're not well studied, especially when they're juvenile fish, which are what the puffins and the terns are eating. And we don't totally understand how they move in the water column in response to things like changes in sea surface temperature. So unfortunately, it's hard to say. We can say that there are species that prefer cooler waters, like the white hake that I mentioned earlier. So if we see warmer waters, it's likely that the hake may disappear from the puffin diet or decline. And if we look at species like butterfish, which prefer warmer waters, we might see more of them in the puffin diet. So the diet composition can certainly change with warming waters, but it's difficult to say exactly how those prey species will respond with warming waters. So our next question is, where do puffins normally live? Are their mates like other animals? Are they life mates like other animals, and do they keep their mate forever? So for puffins, and actually terns too, they're pretty interesting. They typically come back and they nest in the same exact burrow every year. And occasionally they do get displaced by younger birds or new birds looking for a potential nesting site. But they typically will come back to the same burrow with the same mate every year. However, if something happens to that mate and it does not return, then they will seek out another mate and will nest again. And that's likely what happened with Willie this year. And we'll see how it plays out for them. And getting to your question about where do puffins normally live, the Atlantic puffins that are nesting in the Gulf of Maine are at the southerly distribution. They don't nest any further south than eastern egg rock, and they're distributed throughout the North Sea. So going north from where we are in Maine, up towards the UK and Ireland and Scotland, and even further north, they're much more common than they are in the Gulf of Maine. There are also other species of puffins that nest in the Pacific, such as horned puffins and tufted puffins, but there are no Atlantic puffins in the Pacific Ocean. So it depends what ocean you are in, but you can see puffins in both the Pacific and the Atlantic. The next question is, how long is a puffin's lifespan? So some of our puffins can live into their mid-30s or even late 30s, though that is a relatively rare occurrence. We do see, it seems like some of the oldest puffins we typically see are around their mid-20s to late 20s, but it is exciting whenever you see a puffin that's in their 30s, which does happen on occasion. Our next question is, what do puffins eat? So puffins eat a wide variety of prey species. They prefer fish. Some of the most common fish species that we observe in the diet of puffins tend to be species such as sand lance, which is a thin, long fish, similar to kind of a spaghetti noodle. They're quite common some years. They also eat hake and haddock, the same species that you could get along the coast of Maine if you're visiting, and you could go to a restaurant and order haddock, and it would be the same species that our puffins are eating. They also occasionally eat quite a bit of herring. Atlantic herring seems to be the most common species in their diet. And they also eat a wide variety of other species that tend to be less common. Some that people have seen in years past include Atlantic sorry and butterfish. But basically, whatever small fishes they can catch, they'll deliver back to their chicks. And that tends to change from year to year, depending likely on prey availability. Moving on to our next question. When they're on the nest, how can you tell by their beak which is which? So often puffins have very unique patterns in their bills, and this is because they get worn in different ways. Their grooves may be a bit different the way that they grow in, and this allows us to identify the bill of a puffin. And they're not typically too similar, like every single year the same individual isn't going to have the same looking bill. It will vary from year to year, because what ends up happening in the wintertime is they lose all that bright coloration, and then that's replaced again in the spring before they start breeding. So I'm not too great at identifying individual puffins by bill, but if you study them enough, you can certainly do that. But it takes a lot of practice and a lot of looking at the same puffins over and over again. But these burrow cams allow us the perfect opportunity to do that. So study up. I know that there's some viewers that post lots of pictures and talk about the differences between their bills, and studying these photos will allow you to identify them as individuals. So look for the grooves, and then the wearing of the bill. It tends to be a bit different from individual to individual. Our next question is, do parents take turns sitting on the egg? And yes, in fact, they do. So if you watch our burrow cam long enough, you'll likely see a incubation shift, as we call it. And that's when one of the nesting puffins comes in and one of the other puffin pairs will leave. And there's often some ritual to this, and often sometimes one of the adults will bring in some nesting material, or they'll make their classic chainsaw calls to one another. And occasionally they do what's called billing, where they hit their bills back and forth really quickly together. And this is all part of their pair bonding, and it's important to maintain this throughout their nesting period. So if you watch the cams long enough, this is certainly something to look for, and it's certainly quite exciting when it happens, and you get to watch this really fascinating thing happen. Our next question is, have you seen Billy? Unfortunately, we haven't seen Billy yet this year. One of the things that's happening right now, which makes it a little bit difficult to look and read the puffin bands, is that the terns are just settling into nest. We're just getting our first eggs. And when the terns aren't quite settled in yet, you'll often see the puffins flushing off of the boulder berm where one of our cams are, or the loafing ledge. And this is probably because the terns are doing the same thing. They're getting into this pattern, and we call it a dread, when all the terns flush off the island together at the same time. And it's believed that when the terns do this, when they're first settling into their nesting season, it's a strategy for them to work together as a colony and to evade predators. So you might occasionally see all the terns flush off together, and this happens the most early in the season when they're still getting ready to settle in. And most of our terns aren't even spending the night yet. Most of them are going offshore, but today is the first day where we've seen lots of terns around the island throughout the day. So we're hoping that they're going to settle in and start spending the night. And once that happens and the terns are more settled in their nesting, the puffins also settle down. The terns are really a protective umbrella, as we call it, for these nesting puffins. The terns are much more aggressive to predators like peregrine falcons and bald eagles. We actually just had a peregrine falcon yesterday come in and capture a puffin. So the terns are really good at scaring away predators like this, and it really benefits the puffins to be nesting with the terns. And that's how we try to manage these seabird colonies in the Gulf of Maine. So the point being is, until the terns really settle in, there's a lot of movements of birds coming in and out, and it can be really difficult when you're sitting in a bird blind with your spotting scope and trying to identify and read all these bands that have very tiny numbers. But hopefully we're starting to put more effort into things, and we're going to be on the lookout for individuals like Billy, and also individuals from past years of the burrow cam chicks. So our next question is, how many eggs do puffins normally lay? So puffins typically lay only one egg, and this is one of their strategies to breeding. They can't really raise multiple chicks at once. One chick requires a lot of work for puffins. Once this chick hatches, and if you go through the process of watching this chick day in and day out, what you'll see is that they're getting many feedings every day. Sometimes puffins will get 4 to 10 feedings a day on average. Sometimes you might even have a day where they're getting up to 20 feedings per day or more. So these puffin parents are working incredibly hard to raise these chicks. They're often flying upwards of 10 or even 20 miles from our breeding site to go find fish for these nesting for their chicks. And it takes a pretty hard toll on these parents to be flying back and forth, trying to catch enough fish to raise this chick. So one is enough for them, and it seems to be a good strategy for them to nest here on Seal Island. Our next question is, do the puffins on Seal Island have to worry about any predators on the island? So as I just mentioned a minute ago, peregrine falcons often come to the island, and some peregrines are large enough to take puffins, especially unsuspecting puffins. One of the puffin strategies to evade predators, like the peregrine falcon, is to dive under the rocks. So what you might see if you're watching our boulder berm camera or the exterior burrow cam, you might see puffins that occasionally dive and dart underneath the rocks, and this is a strategy to hide from predators. And sometimes those predators could be viewed as us humans coming across the boulder berm when we're doing our research, and they'll hide under there. You might occasionally see a puffin also dart into the burrow cam that isn't one of the parents, and it's a good chance that they may be hiding from a predator, such as a peregrine falcon. But there's also other predators that these puffins have to deal with. Occasionally bald eagles will come and visit the island. We also have great blackback and herring gulls, which can eat a puffin. It's not too common with these puffins. Occasionally a blackback gull might be able to take one, but it's more likely that they'll try to grab one of their chicks if the chick is close to the burrow entrance. All right, so our next question is, any thoughts on Iceland putting out fake puffins to draw them to certain areas/islands? And I'm not sure particularly what the reference is to Iceland in particular. I'll have to look that up later on. But I can tell you that this project first started in the 1970s at a time when there was very few Atlantic puffins nesting in the region. At that time, in the Gulf of Maine, there was only 2 colonies that had nesting puffins. The nearby, our next door neighbor here on Seal Island is Matinicus Rock. They had only 2 pairs of puffins. They're nesting there. And then to the north of us, at the mouth of the Bay of Fundy, there was Machias Seal Island, which still had a relict population of some nesting puffins. So my boss, Dr. Stephen Kress, who will hopefully join us for a live chat at some point during the nesting season here, I think he'll be coming out in July, so we'll hopefully we can get him on then. He came up with this idea to use decoys, or those fake puffins like you'll see on our loafing ledge camera. We have one of those decoys set up there now. He used those decoys and things like mirror boxes. They put up these boxes of mirrors, kind of like you would see in a fun house, where the puffins could come up to the mirror and they would think that they were interacting with a real live puffin. Simultaneously, they also had recordings playing, so the puffin would fly by and think that there was a thriving puffin colony when they heard all these puffin noises and they saw the puffin decoys, and to encourage them to stop by and to nest on the island. But unfortunately, at the time, there wasn't any nesting puffins. Only 2 pairs on Matinicus Rock, and the closest ones were tens of miles away that were nesting. So his idea was to fly up to Newfoundland and to capture chicks on thriving puffin colonies where there were thousands of them, and then fly those chicks back down to islands like Seal Island and another island that we manage called Eastern Egg Rock, and hand rear them in the Seal Island environment, hoping that they would remember the island and come back to the island where they were reared. So in the early 80s, they brought back nearly 1,000 puffin chicks from Newfoundland to Seal Island, and they hand reared them. And eventually those chicks were fed fish and vitamins, and they eventually fledged and went out to sea. And they had to wait many years, but eventually those puffins started coming back and nesting on Seal Island and eastern Egg Rock. And through this process of using the decoys, we also attracted other puffins from the area that were nesting on islands like Matinicus Rock and up on Machias Seal Island. And that's how the population of puffins grew. And that was really the first time that decoys were used in a seabird restoration. And now those techniques are being used all over the world as a means of helping to manage seabird populations that may be threatened or endangered. So our next question, well, we don't have too many more questions, it looks like. But I think I'll give it a minute to see if any more questions come in. But I think we might be getting close to wrapping things up. One thing that I would encourage folks to look out for is not only do we have our Puffin cam up, we'll also have our guillemot camera that just went live yesterday, I believe. So keep an eye out on those guillemots. They're going to be laying their eggs very soon. And they're just a fantastic bird to watch. They're a little bit different than the Puffins. They typically lay 2 eggs, sometimes just 1. And it's really fun to watch the 2 siblings grow up together, especially if there's enough fish. And they eat very different species compared to the Puffins. So I'd encourage you to watch the Puffin burrow, but also the guillemot burrow, and to keep an eye out for some of those other species that I mentioned before on the different loafing ledge cams. We also have the razorbill and the black guillemot, and we have the different gull species. Often people take pictures of things on these cameras, and they're always asking for IDs. But hopefully some of the species that I mentioned earlier you can look up if you're not familiar with them in a guidebook or to Google them. And you can start becoming familiar with more of the other nesting species that are on this island. So as we move to closing things up, I'll just say that I will be on the chat boards every now and then. So if you have a question for me, I believe I'm Keenan Project Puffin, so you can tag me in your questions, and I will do my best to answer them. I'm very happy to answer questions, so please ask away. And if I don't see the question or I don't answer it within around 24 to 48 hours, just post it again, and I'll do my best to get to it. So with that, I think that we'll close things out. I'd like to, first of all, thank everybody for watching. And hopefully we'll have a really great season nesting on Seal Island here. All right. Thanks, everyone.